special coverage for vets without service-connected disabilities. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and lately I've been wading through what I'm starting to think of as the ecosystem of VA benefits. Like, I knew that the Veterans Administration had a reputation for being a bureaucratic quagmire. But wow, some of these programs are just twisting paths and rules and exceptions, and it's really hard to know whether or not a benefit is worth it or just for show. And that is the case with the so-called veterans pension. The bottom line is that this program protects the most financially vulnerable veterans by bringing them just above the poverty line. And the veterans pension should not be confused with other programs that call themselves a pension. And that is particularly true of the DoD retired pay. Sometimes people call a pension. Heck, sometimes I call it a pension, even though technically by law it is not a pension. Anyways, the veterans pension has some pretty rigorous eligibility requirements. There's income and net worth limitations, some countermeasures to prevent fraud, and then it seems like there are some key words that had been left out of the VA website's description of how this program works. I'll get to all that, but it's probably best to start with how much this program actually pays veterans so that you can know whether or not it's worth jumping through all these hoops. To get started, this program has a value called the maximum annual pension rate. Like just about every VA program, this value changes depending on the number and type of dependents you have and whether or not a veteran qualifies for attendance and assistance or is homebound. If you want to see all the different rates, you can go to this website, and I'll put the link in the description. But to see what's really going on here, let's focus on a veteran who doesn't have any dependents and doesn't get any, special increases in compensation. That kind of a vet would have a max annual pension rate of $16,551 in 2024. And just for reference, the federal poverty level for one person is $15,060. That matters because our vet isn't necessarily going to get the maximum annual pension rate. Instead, he's going to get the difference between the max annual pension rate and his income. The point being is that this program only gets you out of poverty. It does not exactly stack on top of other benefits, and one of the reasons for that has to do with how the VA calculates income for this program. They include obvious sources of income like salary, hourly pay, bonuses, commissions, overtime, tips, but then they also include some other things to make it hard to wiggle around the rules. Like when it comes to salary income, they count the income before taxes or retirement contributions or Social Security deductions. If you have a business, they count your gross income, but they don't let you deduct depreciation or operating expenses. So, the typical ways that you reduce your income on paper or even your net worth, well, they're just not going to help very much here. Now, the VA does have some special rules about medical and educational expenses, so if you do have, sort of a high income, but it's getting eaten up by those kinds of expenses, well, you might be able to get yourself below that max annual pension rate. At this point, you might be wondering how income from VA disability compensation plays into this whole system, but we're going to have to get to that a little later because it seems to throw a real monkey wrench into the whole works. Okay, in addition to the income limitations, the VA also has limits on the net worth of a veteran who wants to apply for this program. And just because it's Congress and the VA they treat the concept of net worth completely differently than any financial accountant on the face of the earth. Congress sets a net worth limit that's about $155,000 in 2024. But then the VA includes your annual income in your net worth. Of course, they also include the normal things that get rolled into a net worth calculation. Any real estate like land or buildings, personal property like stocks, bonds, checking accounts, vehicles including boats, even furniture. And then they exclude your primary residence, your car, and some basic household appliances. And if that doesn't make your head hurt, try this one on for size. They have a rule that the land that your house sits on is not excluded if it exceeds 2 acres. What's my point? Well, just like with income, the typical ways that you make your net worth seem smaller, the VA just doesn't play along with those techniques. You truly have to have very little to qualify for the VA pension. What's more, the VA applies a 3-year look back when you submit your application. Essentially, they do a review of your income and assets over the last 3 years with a particular eye towards any transfers that were done below market value. You know, you sold the family ranch to your oldest daughter for $1. But then there's the eligibility requirements. And I gotta be honest, I feel like the VA website contradicts itself about basic eligibility. And I've gone on and I've read U.S. Code and the Code of Federal Regulations that seem to apply to this program, and I don't feel like the VA website tells the whole story. I mean, the first requirement should be very straightforward, your character of service. But at one point, the website says you can't have a dishonorable discharge. And then further down, it says you can't have an other than honorable or a bad conduct or a dishonorable discharge. Second, you got to meet a service requirement of having served during a wartime period. But the exact rules vary depending on when you started your active duty time. If you started on active duty before September 8th, 1980, you have to have served at least 90 days on active duty with at least one of those days during wartime. If you were enlisted and started active duty after September 7th, 1980, you have to have served at least 24 months or the full period for which you were called to active duty. Again, with at least one of those days being during wartime. All right, but what about officers after 1980? Well, this is one of those places where the website gets a little weird and I can't quite tell why. The VA says that if you were an officer and you started on active duty after October 16th, 1981, and you hadn't previously served on active duty for at least 24 months, that you're eligible for the VA pension. And that seems weird to me because I don't understand the gap and I don't understand why there's no mention of wartime service. So if you're somebody who falls into this situation and you're applying for the VA pension, just don't be surprised if, well, you run into a surprise. And then, what exactly constitutes a wartime period? Well, those include the Mexican Border War, World Wars I and II, the Korean conflict. They break the Vietnam War era into 2 parts, one for service in the Republic of Vietnam and a shorter period including service outside of Vietnam. And then finally, they include any Gulf War service starting back on August 2nd, 1990, up to some future date to be determined by Congress. How's that for a forever war? Well, that is a lot, and believe it or not, we're still not done with the eligibility requirements. You also either have to be at least 65 years old or have a permanent and total disability. And you remember when we were talking about income limitations and the idea of VA disability compensation came up, and I told you that it's kind of a fly in the ointment? Well, I think there's something about disabilities that the VA website is glossing over. U.S. Code, Title 38, Section 1521, which appears to be the law governing this benefit, includes the same comment about permanent and total disability, but it goes on to say, from non-service-connected disability. It seems like the VA pension is not intended for somebody who's qualified for VA disability payments, even though someone who was receiving compensation at, say, the 60% level could technically come in at an income below the max annual pension rate. I'm expecting that there are some folks out there with more real-world experience about this particular corner of the bureaucratic maze. So if I'm completely off base, fine, I'll just redo the whole video. Because hopefully you can see that this program is an important backstop to make sure that veterans aren't eating cat food. And at the same time, it is not exactly user-friendly. Back at the beginning of this video, I said how VA benefits form this ecosystem with different programs interacting with and balancing each other. The VA pension seems to have some kind of relationship with another program called individual unemployability. That is a program specifically geared towards veterans who have service-connected disabilities that interfere with their employment. And if you want to learn more about that program, watch this video.